I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week, we've got a wonderful array of topics. Inez is going to walk us through Harvard defying the Trump EO on DEI, putting at risk $2.2 billion worth of federal funding. Then I will go through the latest on the Abrego Garcia case, or as the media dubs him, the Maryland man who was wrongly deported to El Salvador. Ben will talk about the POTUS memo on government censorship as it relates to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And finally, will close us out by walking us through this latest Joe Rogan podcast episode featuring Douglas Murray and Dave Smith debating Israel. So with that, I will turn it over to Inez.
This is again one of those like Christmas moments for me. For more than a decade, I've been encouraging Republicans to go this route with universities. But we have our first big defiance and likely our first big legal battle that will come out of this. So unlike Columbia, which may shortly find itself under consent decree, which is funny in itself, Harvard is refusing the Trump administration's demands, which I'll lay out for you in a moment, are eminently reasonable to continue federal funds and grants flowing to Harvard University. They're primarily staking out their position based on the First Amendment grounds, sort of academic freedom grounds, neither of which apply here, and I'll get to that as well. But the demands that the Trump administration made on them are fully all couched in civil rights law. So some of the demands are couched under Title VI. Those have to do with, the sort of racial harassment over the previous summer, dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian protests and so on. Again, every time I go through Title VI stuff, I feel compelled to remind everybody, this is not about speech, it's about action. So you can stand on the quad in Harvard or anywhere else. You can stand on the quad and scream, I hate that you hate the Jews, that you hate Israel. Once you target Jewish students, for example, following them classroom to classroom, yelling things in their ear, or once you prevent their right to cross the quad and attend classes. So that raises to this level of action of racially based harassment that is prohibited by Title VI of our Civil Rights Act. Now we can pretend that we live in a libertarian universe where that's not the case, and free speech maximalist universe, but there's nothing unusual about the way that Title VI is being enforced here. And in fact, if we flip the races up a little bit and we imagine the KKK protesting on campus and then following around Black students to their classes, preventing them from getting to their classes, you can immediately see why the Civil Rights Act and Title VI is written that way and giving universities the responsibility to prevent this kind of action, this racial harassment. So that's one of the grounds that Harvard is losing its funding for, one of the demands of the Trump administration that they fix. Another one, I can't remember if it was day one or it was definitely the first week, there was this Trump order on DEI, and part of the order directed his administration to go through all universities with endowments of larger than $1 billion and see if they were out of compliance with civil rights law with regard to discriminatory practices surrounding DEI. Okay, and as you can imagine, that was a target-rich environment. One of the schools caught up in those investigations was Harvard University, and this could be anything from illegal admissions discrimination against white and Asian students. It could also be, I think, the easier ground, honestly, to go after universities on this is Title VII as employers, because unlike in the admissions context, which is dependent on a change in Supreme Court doctrine just a couple of years ago, it's never been legal under civil rights law to hire or fire on the basis of race whatsoever. You're not allowed to put your thumb on the scale with regard to race. Now, there's a bunch of private companies that also have openly been discriminating, for example, against white men. That has always been illegal since 1964. It's illegal in the plain text of the statute. It's illegal even admittedly by the leftists who run the EEOC. They just ignore these kinds of cases. But if you ask them, and the media has point blank, like, is this legal in the United States? The answer is no. And many of these universities, probably including Harvard, have plenty on their servers and plenty even in public where they have just admitted to illegal racial hiring and firing, right? Every time you open up a department and you say, I need to hire a majority of POC or underrepresented minorities, that's actually illegal hiring practices in the United States. All of this to say there's a bunch of other bases on which the Trump administration can pull funding. I think they have a really, really strong legal position in doing so. Actually, I think they can argue that they had to pull funding, that is the law that governs federal funds, that federal funds cannot be dispersed to institutions that practice racial discrimination, which Harvard does. And so I think the Trump administration is in a really good position here. There is one part of the legal argument that slightly worries me, and that is like the process, the APA process for the investigation. I don't know enough about that. I know a lot about the regulatory side, but less about the adjudication side of the APA. Maybe Will knows something about it. I don't know. But I don't know if they crossed their T's and dotted their I's in this investigation or not administratively. I hope they did. They have some really, really great and competent people working over there. So my assumption is that they did. But the larger grounds that Harvard is making its case on, academic freedom, First Amendment, all of those things, whether we like it or not, are a subordinate to anti-discrimination law. Every dime of federal money has to go to an institution that respects anti-discrimination law. So with very rare exceptions for some religious institutions and so on. So in any case, the bottom line, universities have built their enormous endowments. They've built their entire business model on the taxpayer dime. And the taxpayer dime comes with certain strings attached to this by the Civil Rights Act. And if universities don't like that deal, and don't want to deal with the Trump administration, they're free to operate the way that Hillsdale College or Bob Jones University do, which is without a dime of federal money. And they have always operated that way, or at least Hillsdale has always operated that way, exactly because they don't want to be tied to the interpretations of the Civil Rights Act, of Title IX, of Title VI, of Title VII. Because under previous Democratic administrations, they've been interpreted in ways that Hillsdale doesn't like. They've always refused federal funds, whether those were in the form of grants or in the form of federally backed loans. But yes, a delicious moment. Universities having to choose between their taxpayer gravy train and their DEI departments. This is a great move by the Trump administration. I think it's a battle they can win. I think it'll be a really, really important battle. And once again, they're pulling out a very important piece of what we're starting to describe as this sort of leftist patronage machine that starts with universities, goes to NGOs funded by grants by places like USAID, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is this whole operation funneling money from leftist bureaucrats to leftist NGOs to leftist universities, right? And a huge number of people who are essentially being paid as a matter of patronage to advance leftist ideas like DEI. So a great move by the Trump administration. We'll see what happens. I don't know what you guys think about Harvard sort of defying this versus Columbia essentially knuckling under, where you think the distinctions are there. And yeah, what do you think? What do you think? This is something that Will and I have been arguing for a long time, I think. So it's nice to finally see it happen.
I think it's great. It seems like an absolute no-brainer to me. I loved what the government said in response to Harvard, which is an investment is not entitlement. You don't get to take money and pretend that there's no strings attached when you're ultimately held accountable to the American taxpayer. And there was a tweet from former President Barack Obama about this, where he said Harvard has set an example for other higher ed institutions, rejecting an unlawful and ham-handed attempt to stifle academic freedom. And he goes on, I hope other institutions follow suit. I mean, the previous two administrations, meaning Obama and Biden, effectuated the same kind of policy through their rewriting of Title IX, with Obama coming up with new rules related to how colleges have to adjudicate sexual assault claims and calling for the revocation of due process for the accused. That was enforced under the auspices of, if you don't follow this new Title IX rule, then you no longer have access to federal funding. Biden attempted.
Amber, just
go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but like,
no, please.
It's so much worse that Obama's such a hypocrite, because the Obama administration not only tried to do what you just said, which the Biden administration did as well, and they had to do as a matter of course, they tried to enforce Title IX against Hillsdale, even though they didn't take any federal money, on the basis that their tax status was essentially, taxpayer money, right? So they didn't even take money, and they tried to enforce the Civil Rights Act the way that they wanted to interpret it against Hillsdale, which took no money, and Harvard takes billions.
Right. And in 2023, it was two female students who sued Hillsdale under Title IX during the Biden administration. And yeah, they tried to enforce these Title IX regulations against Hillsdale, which takes no federal funding. And then Biden, of course, attempted to rewrite Title IX to include gender identity as a protected category, which what was the threat underlying that rewriting of Title IX? It's if you don't comply, you lose federal funding. So now we have a clear-cut case of a university actually defying Title IX and civil rights law without the rewriting of the rules, mind you. And suddenly people are crying that it's academic freedom and stifling of freedom of speech. So this is obviously ridiculous. It's pure blatant hypocrisy from the left, which, by the way, has been diametrically opposed to academic freedom when we're talking about conservative thought for the past 30, 40 years. So I'm really glad to see the administration do this. And I don't think Harvard has a single leg to stand on.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the scene from Inglourious Bastards where the German officer is captured and explained to him that what will happen if he doesn't reveal the position of his friends and in the army, and the Americans tell him, like, we're gonna beat you up, and the guy's like, I respectfully refuse, and the Americans are like, well, oblige him then. And that's what I feel like Harvard's doing here. Harvard is respectfully refusing, and they're about to get beat up with a baseball bat. The reason being is they're clearly in violation of Title VI. They're engaged in racial discrimination. They're trying to defend their right to continue engaging in racial discrimination, and not have any accountability for the way they've treated Jewish students in the past 5 years. Well, okay, we'll make an example of you. That's fine. I expect things to go very badly for Harvard. I don't think their conduct is defensible. I think, if you look at even their admission statistics, like, they're just clearly defying the Supreme Court's holdings in a number of cases, in all the racial discrimination cases. They're just going to get beat up. Good. Harvard deserves it. And I don't think anybody will shed a tear if there are even tanks in Harvard Yard.
I also think it's great the hiding behind the First Amendment defense, these institutions that load the First Amendment, they read hate speech into the First Amendment, which they define as basically speech that they hate, not actual bigotry and vitriol, of course. And then academic freedom and Barack Obama standing behind academic freedom. Does academic freedom mean espousal of Jew hatred, support of terrorist groups, support for the destruction of Western civilization, and then, to Inez's point, most importantly, commensurate action, including violating the rights of students? That's what academic freedom means. You know that these are totally disingenuous arguments being raised. Of course, our tax dollars come with strings attached to them, and we shouldn't be underwriting or subsidizing to any extent institutions that are anathema to our civilization and that work against the interests of the United States. Obviously, when the shoe's on the other foot, the left is going to try to abide by those same standards, but also they control most of these institutions, whereas the right doesn't control these institutions. So this is a much more potent weapon when used against cultural institutions dominated by the left, which is significant. And one last coda worth noting on this is that President Trump put out in a Truth Social post today, as we record on Tuesday, sort of a hypothetical of should Harvard's tax-exempt status be in question. And he said specifically, perhaps Harvard should lose its tax-exempt status and be taxed as a political entity if it keeps pushing political, ideological, and terrorist-inspired / supporting sickness. He added, remember, tax-exempt status is totally contingent on acting in the public interest. That's another shot across the bow, and let's see what happens ultimately with it.
All right, we're going to move to my segment on Abrego Garcia, the quote-unquote Maryland man who was deported to El Salvador. Will and I covered this case pretty extensively a couple of episodes ago, talking about the government's filings in previous immigration proceedings back in 2019 that established that this guy was almost certainly a member of MS-13. He had been residing in the U.S. illegally for more than a decade before he was finally picked up in 2025 and put on one of these flights to El Salvador. He's also a Salvadorian national, so like, congratulations, you got to go home. But the Supreme Court has weighed in on this case and has said that the U.S. government needs to, quote unquote, facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia And the government has responded by reasonably arguing that we cannot force El Salvador to return a Salvadorian national back to the United States. If President Bukele or someone from El Salvador, their whatever the analogous Justice Department is there, decides to return him, then we wouldn't stop him at the border. But we're not going to fly to El Salvador and essentially kidnap this guy to bring him back to the United States. And Bukele was in the Oval Office this week with President Trump and answered questions from the media about this and said, I'm not going to be in the business of smuggling. I'm certainly not going to smuggle my own citizens to the United States. And I'm certainly not going to smuggle someone who is an accused gang member back to the United States, effectively putting the case to rest. The Supreme Court cannot compel Bukele to facilitate or even encourage the return of Abrego Garcia back to the US. So the point is effectively moot now. I've heard a number of legal commentators, including CNN's Jeffrey Toobin of all people, saying that there is nothing that Abrego Garcia's lawyers or the immigration courts or the Supreme Court can do at this point, and that he is not going to be coming back to the United States, which is the right resolution in this case. You all probably remember when we talked about this the first time that Abrego Garcia had a withholding of removal because some immigration judge decided that he was apparently in fear of his life in El Salvador from Barrio 18, which is a rival gang to MS-13, based on them allegedly threatening his mother's pupusa business. So he could have been deported literally anywhere but El Salvador. But now that he's back in El Salvador due to this quote unquote administrative error, is a Salvadorian national, is contained in the Senco prison. The idea that you would ask the US to bring back a known gang member across its border, someone who had no right to be in the US in the first place, who crossed the border illegally from the jump, is absurd. I hope that this is the end of it, as Toobin and other legal commentators have said. But I'm curious on y'all's thoughts on where this goes, if anywhere, and also just the desperation with which the media has sought to reframe who this guy actually is, continuing to refer to him as a Maryland man. There was a Washington Post op-ed that I read this morning where they actually claimed that he had a legal right to be in the United States, which is not true. He did not have asylum. He had a withholding of removal that is not akin to legal status. It's basically a stay in effect on a deportation to a specific country. Again, he could have gone anywhere else. And the questions from those reporters in the Oval Office were just all under the presumption that he had the legal right to be in the US and could not have been deported at all. And then also completely ignoring the evidence that the government provided back in 2019 that he was a member of MS-13. This entire saga is just the classic example that we talk about continuously on this podcast of the media and the Democrats aligning themselves with the dregs of society against normal working Americans. So I'll let the group weigh in on if they think that this case will continue to go any further, and the general media posture towards Abrego Garcia.
Yeah. I mean, everything Amber said is right on. The fact that this is still going as like this major controversy is bizarre because it's quite obvious that this guy will never be able to reside in the United States. I think that's a lot of what's missing here. You know, you call him a Maryland man. One of the reasons that's so deceptive is the guy's a Salvadoran national with no legal right to be in the United States, and he never will have that right. Even if he prevails on the idea that his removal to El Salvador was wrong and manages to get El Salvador to release him and then to get on a flight to the United States, okay, great. Well, then we'll detain him here because he doesn't have a legal right to be in the country. And then we'll try, we'll go through the normal legal process of getting him removed, which we will prevail on for two independent reasons. First off, we have some evidence that he's a member of MS-13. That's almost certainly sufficient to remove him because it means if you're a member of what's now a designated terrorist group, you're ineligible for withholding of removal. Second, as I've discussed in a previous episode, the circumstances that were the basis for the granting of withholding removal, which is the fears of the 18th Street gang, those have been obviated by the fact that Bukele has crushed all the gangs. El Salvador is now one of the safest countries in the Western Hemisphere. So there's no reasonable fear of persecution, which means he has to go home. So in either instance, he's going to go home to El Salvador. And even if he doesn't win that, he's still a removable illegal alien, so we can find a third country to send him to. So there's no world where he gets to come back to the United States and come back and live in Maryland again. Sorry, you had 13 years of that without ever getting legal status. That's come to an end. And there's another key point. I think that this is something that's missing from a lot of the discussion in terms of the court cases. There's this idea that the United States can obviously just return him because we're paying El Salvador to house him, but that's probably not true. We don't have the contract. And I remember from the earlier news reporting and from some hints I've seen from the administration officials, there's a contract for them to hold Venezuelan nationals that Maduro refused to take back. So El Salvador is holding the Tren de Aragua criminals on a contractual basis to the United States. That's not the basis on which we returned the El Salvadorans, the members of MS-13. Those are just Salvadoran nationals that El Salvador is obligated to take back and that are now being held in Salvadoran custody as Salvadoran nationals. So we don't just get to say, oh, we'll cancel your contract or under the terms of our contract, give us Abrego Garcia back. That's not how it's going to work. Like, this is core diplomacy. It's clearly not something the Article 3 courts can order. Like, even if the underlying removal was wrongful, for there to be standing, there has to be a redressable harm, and this just isn't redressable. And even if it were, the guy's going back to El Salvador no matter what. People keep, there's so many red herrings. Is the guy MS-13? Like, did he have a criminal record? Doesn't matter. He's an illegal alien. He goes home.
I would just say, since we've kind of covered the merits and the legal aspects of this, and I guess I make no predictions about what's going to happen in federal courts based upon what we've witnessed to this point during both Trump 1 and Trump 2. It is remarkable, just again, how out of touch and out of step not only the corporate media is, which we know, but also just the rank and file Democrats are on issues like this. They are showing once again that there is no one and nothing they will not defend in pursuit of Trump. This has to be more than an 80-20 issue, probably. They want to stand with illegal gang members being deported from the country. They want to try to prevent that. Be our guest. It's such a losing political issue. It's so wrong on the merits. It's so just insane and lacking in common sense. And it shows you that they have really learned nothing since Donald Trump's second victory. And I think that's a boon to the country. And really, where this is going to get tested ultimately is going to be when we move past the hardened criminal illegal aliens to things like workplace enforcement, which are much more politically sensitive. And the lobby is going to be much stronger on the other side. Let's see what happens when we get there. But in some ways, you have the left softening the ground by defending the absolute worst of the worst criminals, gang members, now members of designated terrorist organizations in this country, and trying to do everything they can to prevent them from being kicked out of the U.S.
Yeah, they really don't know how to choose a cause, do they? Like, you would think that they would find somebody among the people who have been deported who maybe was guilty of some minor crime, right? And was sympathetic, and they really have, blown, as Ben just said, I think they've kind of blown their political capital defending people who not only, and I'm not saying that the worst don't deserve some level of due process, depending on, their citizenship, the facts of their case. Everybody deserves due process and establishment of the facts, but like, they're not choosing their battles in a politically wise way. This is a guy that has had due process. A court has declared him removable illegally in the United States and found merit to the charge that he's a gang member. Those are all been established with full due process in the courts. The only thing that's still on the table is this additional claim that Will has explained so well, and Amber has explained so well, this additional, like, very transparently, sort of false and like convenient claim, right, of last ditch asylum to try to string out the court process for longer. That's what we're talking about. All the relevant facts of the case, and as Will pointed out, there has to be a harm that's addressed, right? All the relevant facts of the case have been adjudicated. This guy has gotten extensive due process to adjudicate them, and he just doesn't belong in the United States. But yeah, they're choosing guys like this. They're to defend. They're choosing, on the firing bureaucrats thing, right? They're finding like the least sort of sympathetic cases. Like, one guy who worked for Samantha Power is like, this is the problem is the journalists are all interviewing their friends, right? And so they're all just like really obvious people who made lots of money working in government, who are obviously connected to Democrats, or in one case, like he was interviewing the trans federal worker, and that's how the story was framed. It's like they really don't know how these examples land with an American people who 75% of which of us work at will, right? Like Americans are just finding out where their grants, the crazy stuff that their grants are funding, the fact that federal workers don't work at will and they have like these impossible protections around them, right? And they're finding out that these people who are being deported are like really, really bad guys. And those are the things that the facts that the American people are finding out from the fact that Democrats are choosing them as champions. So I don't think they're being particularly savvy. It has been amazing to watch the Democratic PR machine sort of collapse in this way.
We're going to go to Ben now, our government censorship Sherpa, to walk us through Trump's latest memo on CISA.
Yeah, so this was a news item last week, and I think the headline of it and the way it was framed actually distracts from the significance of this memorandum that President Trump put out. So on April 9th, the administration issued this order that did a couple of things. The headline was that the former head of CISA, the first head of CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, a sub-agency of the Homeland Security Department, that the Trump administration ordered the revocation of its director, first director, Chris Krebs, and also called for a review of security clearances for anyone at the cybersecurity firm that he works at today. Within the order, and of course, so the media frames this as, well, this is Trump engaging in revenge against Chris Krebs, who went out there right after the 2020 election and said this is the most secure election in the history of mankind, despite the fact that he ignored later reports that we would see CISA put out talking about vulnerabilities in voting machines and things like that. But also, the memorandum laid out the fact that Chris Krebs himself was the leader of CISA and really supported major policies that arguably violated our First Amendment rights directly and by proxy. CISA itself, as I've talked about too often probably before on this podcast, was sort of the nerve center of federal government-led speech policing in the run-up to the 2020 election, and then exploding subsequently to that election, first with the focus on Hunter Biden laptop story and questions of election integrity and outcomes, and then later with respect to all things COVID-19, social media, censorship. And CISA engaged in any number of ways, including helping birth kind of the quote-unquote private sector or non-governmental coalitions of cutouts that surveilled en masse social media, looking for wrongthink on any number of issues, and then created these tickets that they flagged to the social media companies to censor protected speech. They also served in a function of collecting reports of dis, and malinformation from others and forwarding them along to social media companies. And CISA funding also went to outside entities that themselves were responsible for flagging purported dis, and malinformation to social media companies and censoring them. And they did a bunch of other related activities as well, all under the guise, especially when it comes to the election integrity stuff, of we need to protect election infrastructure. And that includes essentially treating tweets that call into question the integrity of our elections as effectively mini digital terrorist attacks on our elections writ large. And Chris Krebs was really the leader of these efforts. He was fired summarily after he went on television talking about how 2020 was the most secure election in history. But he's never faced any sort of reckoning. And he actually went and formed a consultancy with one of the outside leaders of the Election Integrity Partnership, which was sort of the key outsourced censorship vehicle in 2020. And Krebs, like almost everyone involved in the censorship industrial complex, has never faced a reckoning beyond essentially oversight efforts that have exposed to some extent what's transpired in recent years. So this order not only causes real penalty for those activities, because having your security clearance revoked, there's probably a dollar value, a not insignificant one, that we can ascribe to that for someone working in the private sector on purportedly security-related matters. But also, the order calls for probing CISA's activities over the last 6 years, and finding out whether it violated Americans' First Amendment rights and or other laws in conjunction with the first day executive order the Trump administration put out, also similarly calling for a review of censorship industrial complex actions, and then calling for the production of, from federal authorities, recommendations for remedial action or preventative action going forward. And that's with respect to both Krebs and everyone in CISA. So this is significant since CISA is sort of the tip of the spear here, and the fact that the administration is looking specifically at probing it, and not just over the last 4 years, but over the last 6 years, which is really since CISA's inception. That's hugely significant. It tells you they have their eye on the ball in terms of reviewing past actions, which is imperative to ensuring that the censorship industrial complex is dismantled going forward. So we still have to wait and see what ultimately the probes find, what the administration's proposed policies look like, and then what Congress is going to codify legislatively. But I think this is another sign that the administration has its eye on the ball here. That's significant. And I think that this CISA probe is an underappreciated but really significant story that's clouded by the media's focus on Trump versus Krebs and a revenge tour and those other ridiculous narratives that they like to put out. The real importance is CISA was a hugely bad actor in censorship activities, and now maybe it'll be the first entity that faces a serious reckoning from this administration. So with that, I turn it over to the group. What do you make of this order? What do you see coming down the pike?
Yeah, I think one thing that's important to highlight here, and you know the details of the structure of CISA way better than I do, but the best chance we had at restraining this, I think, on the Supreme Court level was Murphy, and that didn't work, right? There will never be a record as clear as the one that Murphy built ever again, for two reasons. One, Elon Musk buying Twitter was a sort of black swan event. I don't like for our policy to be sort of billionaire ex machina, right? It didn't really solve any of the underlying problems. It just such an important actor switched hands, and then Elon Musk released, right, a lot of these communications that were happening between. I know that they were also happening with Facebook and so on and so on, but we got more of that record, the communications between the government and social media companies than we would in basically any other instance. And then second, once this case did go to the Supreme Court, these actors are no longer going to put their communiques in emails, right? They're just not going to do it anymore. They're going to meet at Le Diplomat in DC and talk about it. And they're going to say, hey, like these accounts, I don't like these accounts, right? So I just don't think that from the legal perspective, I think that was the best bite we probably would have had at the apple. These sort of influence games are so difficult to nail down that just means that it's all the more imperative for two things to happen. One, to deal with this legislatively and policy wise. And two, if even that fails, then it's all the more important for the Trump administration to administratively dismantle the apparatus here so that at least it takes the left some time to rebuild.
I think it's worth mentioning here that the FTC is currently in trial against Facebook and Meta for its purchase of Instagram and WhatsApp. And Meta has, of course, been lobbying the administration over the past 6 months since Trump was elected of trying to get them to drop this case. And regardless of where you stand on antitrust legislation and enforcement, I think the fact that Meta has essentially been making the public case that since Mark Zuckerberg has dropped these content moderation standards back in January, and he's totally a libertarian now, that we just need to trust that Meta is going to do the right thing when it comes to censorship. But obviously, they didn't do the right thing when we were in the midst of the 2020 election and the pandemic, and the government allegedly yelling at Meta staffers and Facebook staffers to remove certain posts that they flagged as misinformation. The ultimate question is, okay, well, did Zuckerberg really have a come to Jesus moment and he found what the government was doing so detestable, but didn't feel like he could stand up at the time, or is this just a changing of the political winds and he knows which side his bread's getting buttered on? And so he's going to play ball as long as Trump is in office. And the next time a Democrat's in office and tries to revive the government censorship machine, Zuckerberg's going to go back to his old ways and Facebook's going to be a content moderation machine again. And so it's exactly what Inez said of the sort of fiat by billionaire, where you have basically 4 or 5 people that are in charge of 90% of social media content. And the American people have to, at this point, simply trust that they're going to do the right thing, which is not an appropriate way or a realistic or feasible way of allowing these content moderation decisions to be made in a way that allows for the most amount of freedom of speech as you can possibly ask for, and certainly not in making sure that these companies are not compromised by the government. So as long as Facebook owns both Instagram and WhatsApp, I think it's a reasonable question for the FTC to say that you have too much power in this space. What if Elon Musk decides to sell X tomorrow, right? Like, we're in the same position that we were 5 years ago. So I just wanted to bring up that case and sort of the implications and the trust me, bro, vibes from Meta as we're going about this, as Trump is trying to sort of unwind the censorship regime from the government side.
Yeah, I mean, all this is interesting. I was actually at the Justice Department for like a conference held by the Antitrust Division and the new head of Antitrust, Gail Slater. And it had the FCC head, Brendan Carr, the new FTC chair, Andrew Ferguson. They're all really focused on trying to figure out what to do about these companies and to use their powers to fight censorship, to punish them for prior censorship, to prevent it from going forward in the future. I'm really, I'm enthused about this. We've obviously got the problem of the Supreme Court that doesn't really think this is acceptable, that doesn't think you can essentially force these companies to stop censoring political viewpoints they don't like. I think the court got it wrong, but it was really reassuring that, what used to be, what felt like being a lone voice in the wilderness 6 or 7 years ago, suddenly it's the entire Department of Justice and other agencies as well that's focused on solving the problem of censorship. So I'm pretty optimistic about it.
And we're going to go right back to Will to walk us through this debate on Joe Rogan between Dave Smith and Douglas Murray on Israel versus Palestine.
So yeah, there was a debate. I think it was Thursday. It was late last week. That was between Dave Smith and Douglas Murray on Joe Rogan. It started with a kind of broader topic of expertise and whether or not Joe Rogan is bringing on too many voices that are anti-Israel and kind of crackpotish. And eventually, it got to the nitty-gritty of a debate about Israel. I felt like the first part of the debate was kind of just a wash in the sense of you had. Clearly Douglas Murray has a pretty strong point about certain people that Rogan's bringing on are being utterly ridiculous. People like Ian Carroll, who's just a straight up dude's a straight up conspiracy theorist who doesn't know anything, and it's not clear why he's getting any sort of platform at all. But it's also like there's a whininess to that. It's like, why are you talking to these people, et cetera, which is not particularly appealing. And, at the end of the day, it's about dealing with the arguments. And I think Murray would have been a lot better served if he had started with the second part of the debate and made that the first part of the debate, which was when he actually got into it with Dave Smith on Israel. And the basic thing here is that Murray's just right. I mean, Dave Smith's basically arguing against the Israeli action in Gaza. And his arguments are like, well, why do you have to kill all these people? Why, isn't there another way? But at no point is there actually a clear alternative laid out. And there's no explanation of exactly what Israel was supposed to do in response to October 7th. And Murray's just right on the facts, like all the way that Smith kind of characterizes the Israeli blockade, for example, or the idea that Gaza is a concentration camp. All this stuff is just not true. And it led to an interesting point that Murray made that I think is underplayed, and is that, Murray asked him, like, have you actually ever been to Israel? And Smith's like, no. And a lot of people are like, well, do you have to go somewhere to talk about a place? And obviously the answer to that is no. But at the same point, like, you could go to Israel and it would actually give you a sense of why these things like the blockade don't make sense. It would give you a sense of Israeli motivations to make you not see them as just inhuman. And so, like, in general, I mean, I can understand why a lot of people maybe found Murray off-putting and kind of arrogant. He's got a British style of debating that doesn't necessarily appeal to a lot of people. But on the substance, he was just right on so many of these issues. And I think that, one of the things that Dave Smith and a lot of the anti-Zionists get away with is this weird kind of ducking and weaving, where when asked straight questions about like, what would you actually have Israel do in response to something like the 10/7 attacks? They're like, well, I wouldn't do what they're doing, but they don't actually provide like an alternative plan or something that accommodates the obvious Israeli strategic interests. So I don't know. I think, I made a lot of news last week. I think it's a little bit less in the news now, but I think in general, there's a weirdness. I mean, I don't view Dave Smith as anti-Semitic. He's just kind of a goofy libertarian in my eyes, but I don't see why, I don't think his position really needs to be given a lot of substantive credence because it's just not right on the facts. But I'm curious what you guys all think of it.
Well, I think my assessment of the actual debate, which I in full disclosure, I don't know why, but I can't do, unless I really, really love the yes, I cannot do 3.5 hours of Joe Rogan. I think he's like an open-minded, interesting guy, which is why I think he has the platform he does. He asks these questions of like a lot of weird people. But I just personally can't do 3 hours. So I did like 90 minutes of this and then I couldn't do it anymore. But I agree with Will's assessment of sort of the first and second parts of the debate. I think once the debate moved to the actual substance of what's happening in Israel, I thought Douglas Murray obviously had a better command of the facts. The first part of it, though, I think is really interesting and important for people to really get into their heads. And that is to actually, because Douglas Murray repeatedly, and I like Douglas Murray, I like his books, but I just think he lost this part of the exchange with appeals to authority. And he multiple times references the fact of lost trust in institutions, right? And he says, I understand that people don't trust it because our set of experts were obviously wrong on so many of these things, right? And then he continues to rely on authority. I think we have to actually grapple with what that lost trust in institutions and experts actually means. You can't just acknowledge it as a fact. It means you have to internalize it and understand that therefore there's going to be a lot of stupid arguments that we're going to have to on people who have really invested a lot of time and it's in serious scholarship and in serious research to actually rebut point by point. So, for example, the first part of it, they're talking a lot about Darryl Cooper and his theories about Churchill being the villain of World War II, right? What's necessary there is not to say that Darryl is a Nazi. It's to do the point-by-point rebuttal on where his history is wrong, which I think Victor Davis Hanson did the best job of doing, on why, the explanations that he gives and the motivations he gives and even some of the underlying facts that he gives about Churchill's decision-making in World War II are just historically incorrect. And so I just don't think that in this debate, at least, Murray really grappled with the fact that, yeah, like, if you do take scholarship seriously, for example, of World War II, like some of these things are going to seem so absurd to you, you're going to want to impute, sort of ill intent to them. And sometimes there is ill intent, but in either case, you're still going to have to start at square one because people have rightly lost so much trust that the appeal to common narrative or authority of institutions is just going to be dead on arrival. And for the record, I don't think that's a good thing for society. There are rules for institutional narratives, for institutional knowledge, right? There's a role for real scholarship, which is to avoid what I call the autodidact problem. You can be a really, really smart person. You can read a couple books for example, in a particular topic of history, but it really is the work of a lifetime of a professor in an institution to read all of the available literature and original source documents on something and then try to come to some kind of balanced conclusion that acknowledges the bias of various sources. It would be like if you came from another country and then just started reading the headlines in the United States and you read one headline from the Wall Street Journal and one from the New York Times and another from Breitbart, right? You'd have no idea where those various sort of perspectives came from, and it would be difficult to come to a conclusion about American politics. So there is this real role for institutions, but the reason we don't get to rely on that role is because the institutions themselves abandoned it. They abandoned the standards of scholarship on which that trust relies, and then they lied to the public extensively. So that's why we're in the position that we're in. So, I mean, I just think this is like a really important well beyond like the debate about Israel or Gaza or whatever else. I mean, I think we are in sort of this rebuilding phase where we're going to have to take people seriously. People are rightly going to question now everything. And some of the things they question are going to be true, right? Like they're going to be skeptical about things that are true, just because they came from untrustworthy actors at some point. And I think it's sort of the difficult work of civilization that we're going to have to rebuild that trust. And it starts by rebutting the actual underlying argument and facts, and not relying on authority or attributing incentives, or I'm sorry, not incentives, sort of like ideological motivation, right? Because I think those arguments are just not convincing to people anymore. You got to go back to square one and start talking about why Churchill made the decisions he did during World War II.
Yeah, I don't have much to add on the substance of the debate itself, except that despite the criticisms of Joe Rogan that came from Douglas Murray, like I can't think of many other platforms that would have allowed a 3.5 hour debate of this kind to even air uninterrupted. So I think it's a really great endorsement of new media and its role in the information environment, that we go beyond appeals to authority. And you do have these really substantive, like basic debates about the facts that are being presented. And so I thought this was a great example of that.
So there were a lot of different levels to this podcast that present different food for thought in terms of the competing views and what Murray, for example, was actually aiming at. And I'll say at the outset, I have not watched the full thing. I probably watched the first half hour or so, which mainly dealt with the whole appeals to authority issue. And I agree, that's an off-putting argument on its face. Let's just delve into the substance. Here's your claim. Here's the counterclaim. Here's all the facts and evidence to support my side. What are your facts and evidence? Here's why I'm clearly going to defeat you on this issue, and your side is really lacking in credibility on this. Murray, what it seems like he actually wanted to get to was confronting Joe Rogan about why are you platforming certain people seemingly disproportionately who take a certain view on the Israel versus the Arabs issue. And it also seemed like he was trying to make a secondary or related point, which is that Murray thinks that the incentive structure points towards putting on the people who take the provocative, either pro-Hamas or Hamas adjacent sort of view, even though Rogan and probably those that he's platformed would say that's not our argument. But if in effect that is, I would say in effect, in many cases, it does look that way. And Murray was basically trying to get around to, and he sort of says this, like, where the left has gone, there's also an emergence on the right of a similar sort of position when it comes to kind of America's adversaries of Judeo-Christian Western civilization, sort of taking their side, or at least casting, the West as the bad guy and throwing out the baby with the bathwater, despite the fact that the West does have plenty of warts and there have been plenty of mistakes in our policies. He could have led with that instead of going with the appeal to authority issue. And like, if you're going to make the appeal to authority case, then show why you're the authority here, and then assert your claims and debunk the other side's claims. And I think later on in the episode, based on some of the clips I've seen and what I've read, they do get into the substance of the arguments, and I do think Murray wins there. But this podcast, I think one of the reasons it sparks so many responses, and is first of all, both sides on this issue really can't engage at the end of the day. They're operating in totally different worldview spaces. But it also points to, a potential emerging rift on the right, which is probably louder in terms of the voices amplified than where the actual sentiment is. Over Israel, over issues of national security and foreign policy broadly. They're far more nuanced than the kind of conversation you're going to have between one person on one side and one person on the other side of an issue. But it does potentially threaten a coalition, and it does raise debates and challenging questions that ultimately are probably going to have to be grappled with. And I think, to Murray's point, it's clear that there are voices that are ascendant, at least on the online new right, let's say, that hold positions that appear to be anathema to what MAGA is, but are trying to wear the mantle of MAGA to justify their positions. And this is going to be a generational, probably, debate that's going to manifest itself over lots of different national security and foreign policy issues in the years to come. So I think it's a necessary debate probably, but the way that it played out in this format, I think, was probably unhelpful and didn't really advance the ball.
With that, we're going to move to final thoughts, and I will go ahead and go first. I'll take the moderator's prerogative. There was an interview that aired on CNN this past weekend between Donnie O'Sullivan and Taylor Lorenz. And Taylor Lorenz provides this sort of slobbering review of Luigi Mangione, the accused assassin of the United Healthcare CEO. And she says, quote, "You're going to see women especially that feel like, oh my God, like here's this man who's a revolutionary, who's famous, who's handsome, who's young, who's smart. He's a person that seems like there's like this morally good man, which is hard to find." And Donnie O'Sullivan sort of giggles along and they have a grand old time talking about how wonderful Luigi Mangione is and how totally normal it is that women are fawning over this guy as if he's some kind of cult hero and writing him love letters and the like. I think there's been plenty of commentary on how despicable her framing of this issue is. But one thing that was missed by a lot of people is that Donnie O'Sullivan, the anchor who's doing this misinformation series on CNN, just 2 days prior to this interview airing on Sunday, he was on CNN on Friday giving an interview about what he's learned about extremism through this project. And he says that basically there's no comparison between what he calls right-wing extremism versus left-wing extremism, because right-wing extremism is far more fervent and far more widespread than anything that he's seen on the left. Effectively, there's no trend of extremism on the left. There's no organized groups dedicated to extremism on the left. And of course, he cites things like January 6th as his primary example as to why this is true. But for him to say that on Friday and then 2 days later air an interview with a former mainstream media reporter who worked at two of the biggest legacy outlets, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, fawning over an accused murderer, and somehow doesn't see the connection between that and left-wing extremism, as she's talking about how Luigi Mangione was fighting this system that was oppressing Americans by giving them health insurance, was just so unbelievable. The cognitive dissonance between those two positions. I just felt like I had to point out the Friday interview versus the Sunday interview, because every time we hear these mainstream media sources talk about domestic extremism, they're always framing it as like the neo-Nazis on the right. But they never talk about Antifa, BLM, the Tesla attacks, the fawning over Luigi Mangione, and all of the other trends of left-wing people not just being extreme, but actually delighting in violence and viewing people who commit violence as heroes.
Yeah, imagine if the right had a popular magazine named after, I don't know, helicopters. I keep pointing this out, but the left has a popular magazine called Jacobin. So I don't know what the equivalent would be on the right, like cheering and dropping communists from helicopters, or I'm not sure how to pithily put that into Helicopter Weekly or whatever. No, my final thought is this TikTok video that went viral during our trade wars with China that are, I think, as we said last week, really, I think, congealing into a kind of understandable narrative over who's getting targeted and how these negotiations are proceeding. We still don't know what's going to happen ultimately with that underlying trade war, but there's this TikTok video from a Chinese manufacturer that went viral where he's holding up various recognizable luxury handbag designs and saying, well, we were making these in China, but now you have a trade war with us, so I guess we're just going to have to start making them and selling them for pennies on the dollar of the cost of whatever Hermes was selling the Birkin for. So first of all, it appears that it's the underlying facts may not be as true as they seemed. It seems like there is still a lot of production for these luxury line sort of fashion industry brands in Italy and France. It may be that like some of the components are made in China, so on and so forth. But even taking it on its word, I think it really highlights the problem with doing business in China, which is Let's say that it's true. Let's say that Hermes sends the pattern for the Birkin bag to China, and then China sources the leather, the whatever, and they put it all together based on a design that was come up with by somebody, somebody's intellectual property. Well, they just threatened to the whole world, like, yeah, well, we're just going to steal your intellectual property and make it cheaper ourselves and sell a knockoff, right? And I think that happens with things that are a lot more important than handbags. And I think it's a really good reminder that the initial part of the relationship, right, when companies want to sell either into the Chinese market or they want incredibly cheap manufacturing costs, those things come at a cost even beyond the sort of national level problems that come with this massive manufacturing drain to China, and the national security problems that come along with that. Also, just you can't have capitalism without any rule of law and without any kind of contract enforcement. You're doing business with the mob, right? And when the mob has an advantage over you, they will take it. They will take your intellectual property. They will sell the exact same product for cheaper, and they'll put you out of business. That has been the Chinese model. And it's worked really well for China and really badly for American businesses who still continue to sell off their crown IP jewels to China, for access to the market and some paper guarantees from a country where those things cannot be enforced and will not be enforced. So I just thought it was a kind of a weird self-own by this Chinese manufacturer to basically announce that anyone who does business with him, like, basically forego your intellectual property because he's going to produce it himself for cheaper when it becomes convenient for him. And I thought it was a really excellent metaphor for our trade and manufacturing lines in China more generally. One line to note that's unrelated, FTC against Meta, the trial began at this point a day and a half ago. Something to keep an eye on. I think I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, but I'm sure next week we'll be talking about it. This is an important antitrust case to keep an eye on going forward.
So really briefly, one thing that I've been tracking, which is kind of wonky but hugely significant, and this dates back a few years to a piece that I wrote with Mark Hemingway for Real Clear Investigations on Social Security Administration and the treasure trove of data that it and the IRS sit on with respect to illegal aliens, which could be used to actually engage in enforcement actions against illegal aliens who are using potentially millions of our social security numbers or fraudulent social security numbers to work in this country to pursue them. For years, these government agencies have not talked to each other. They have not shared their databases and information, purportedly because there are privacy-related laws and regulations that make it hard for them to share that information. But the Trump administration is trying to break down these walls where these data sources have been siloed in pursuit of policies, including for targeting non-citizens who may be on the voter rolls, and as well with respect to tracking down criminal illegal aliens to this point. So there's been some controversy over this memorandum of understanding that was recently inked between the Treasury Department and Department of Homeland Security that allows them to share information in pursuit of those who are being pursued on non-tax crimes. There's the expectation that this is going to be expanded to a much larger population than this population of over 6,000 people who were either on the terrorism watch list or otherwise being pursued for crimes, I think, on the FBI's radar. But the bigger kind of theme here is Trump administration, in conjunction with DOJ, exploiting its data sets and seeking to compare these data sets across agencies to find out where there's waste, fraud, and abuse, and to engage in enforcement actions based upon the data they have at hand. This also goes to an executive order the administration put forth calling on DHS to examine state voter rolls and compare them to federal databases and even to subpoena additional state records to try and find if there are non-citizens on the rolls, and then either engage in enforcement actions against them or share the information with the states so they clean up their rolls. These are totally reasonable, common sense measures to take when you're sitting on these data sources, and they can be used to ensure election integrity. They can be used to wring out waste, fraud, and abuse from government programs that are being abused by thieves and by illegal aliens. The left is challenging many of these actions in the courts, again, claiming there are privacy violations. But I think it's though a wonky issue and an in the weeds issue, a really important and common sense thing that these federal databases be cross-compared to figure out where there's waste, fraud, abuse, and rot, and to pursue it and purge it from the system using every authority the federal government has. So this is something to watch as DOJ continues to pursue its goals and as the administration pursues its goals more broadly as well. And I'll be reporting on this for Real Core Investigations within the next couple weeks.
Yeah, my final thought is, I guess, on the Abrego Garcia thing. I think Chris Van Hollen has said that he's going to go to El Salvador to fight for his constituent. I mean, let's start with the offensiveness of Van Hollen. If you're a Maryland senator, like, or a Maryland resident rather, and hearing him say, "Oh yes, this illegal alien, my constituent," he's not your constituent. It's an illegal alien. He doesn't he doesn't vote for you. He's not entitled to any of the benefits Maryland citizens are, etc. But anyway, he's decided he's like, I'm going to go to El Salvador, which just gives Nayib Bukele the opportunity to do the funniest thing imaginable. So I'll leave that as my final thought. That would be really funny. Probably illegal, really, really funny.
All right, that's going to do it for us. On behalf of Ben, Inez, and Will, I'm Amber Duke. Thank you all so much for tuning in to NatCon Squad, and we will see you next week.